has China ever really had anything like a sort of broad-based kind of democratic or even just sort of non-tyrannical form of government?
Not for any length of time. No, I mean it's yeah, but I don't buy into these cultural arguments. You're getting into the Lee Kuan Yew Asian values argument, right? That because
Kind of.
Asia, because of its history and its culture, is a bad fit for Western style democratic systems. And the fact is that's been proven to be dead wrong when you look at what's happened in South Korea, for example, where you have a very stable, very vibrant democracy, Taiwan, Japan, and so on. And these are societies, I mentioned those three specifically, because these are societies that were heavily influenced by Chinese civilization and Chinese culture. They're, traditional governments in Korea, especially. Traditional government in Korea was very much built Chinese models institutions. The Japanese borrowed into Chinese institutions. They all read Chinese classics. That was the basis of a lot of education in the region. And yet democracy seemed to be working quite nicely in these places. So I don't buy into these cultural arguments that certain people want to live under authoritarian systems because of what happened 2,000 years ago. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, the thing with Japan and South Korea, however, is that they were invaded and occupied by foreign forces that were able to completely reconstruct their societies from the outside.
That was true
scenario
with Japan on a certain level, but remember, it also stuck.
But maybe if the West were to occupy all of China and turn it, maybe all that cultural baggage would disappear.
No, but it's also, look, yes, you could argue that because of the U.S. influence in some of these places, events worked out differently than it would in a place like China, sure. But, look at what happened with Korea, for example. I mean, when Korea started its big economic ascent in the 1960s, it was a dictatorship, and it was through the late 1980s. And at that point, it was really the Korean public that was like, we're not doing this anymore. They wanted political rights to match their economic rights, really. You had a massive protest movement that eventually tossed out the dictators, and you've had democratic systems in place, ever since.
Hong Kong, for example, or Taiwan. I mean, these are very successful, or they were. Hong Kong was a very successful little mini state. And also when you look at the astonishing success that Asian Americans have in the West, so that Asian Americans take to people with Chinese culture or Asian background and history and so on, actually thrive in America and in a capitalist democratic system. Partly because it seems to me, now tell me I'm being completely wrong here, but when you think of Confucius, you think of this very strong family component, which we now understand to be kind of crucial to raising kids, that they're best able to exploit the world and to do well in life. They have strict understanding of learning, of the necessity and importance of studying, and university and college is a real ethic of education, which is also can be traced back to Confucius, and thrift, which is another Confucian value, right? And so, in fact, many of the characteristics of a more traditional Asian culture could be slot right into a Protestant work ethic and the classic conditions for successful capitalist economies, right, as long as they have a very stable social unit. And what's happened in America, of course, is we've had this incredible wealth, but also destabilization of these core social units, as well as the difficulty of a very culturally and racially and ethnically fractured country, which isn't true, as far as I can tell, in China. In some ways, they have advantages, do they not?
Well, I don't know. I think there's a limit to these cultural aspects in terms of economic progress. I mean, when there was a lot of writing about why did China lose its great advantage over the West, right? Why didn't the Industrial Revolution happen in China? China was much more economically advanced than Europe for, much of early human history, and was an incredibly innovative society, and yet somehow it fell behind. And there's been volumes and volumes written about this, but there's one element of it was, well, they blame Confucianism. That Confucianism was staid and backward looking and anti-science and so on and so on, and then when you had the Asian economic miracle and you had Japan and Korea and Singapore and eventually China and these societies excelling, Well, then people looked around and said, oh, well, why are they so much more successful than other developing countries around the world? Oh, it's Confucianism. Oh, because it does all these. Well, it can't be both, guys. So it can't be both the reason for Asia's collapse and the reason for Asia's success. So I think I'm a little wary of cultural arguments for these things. I tend to think that a lot of it, people are people, and when they're given proper opportunities, they will take advantage of them. When they have opportunities to better educate their children, when they have opportunities to start companies, they will take advantage of them. And I think that when you look at the success, including in China, why has China been so successful? It's not because of the Communist Party and what they did. It's because of what the Communist Party didn't do. The Communist Party finally got out of the way of the Chinese people.